Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Sunday, everybody. I hope you're enjoying your weekend. Today's episode is a special episode. My apologies for interrupting your day of rest, but this week has seen so many important developments, particularly on the EU-China front, which we will cover today, as well as other key areas, and so a video had to be published today. There should be regular episodes, as usual, next week too. On Thursday, European Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen gave a speech on China, which commentators have observed is quite hawkish by European official standards. Ms. von der Leyen expressed that the EU must continue engaging with China, but needs a strategy for de-risking its relationship and dependencies on China. She stressed that her goal is not to decouple. What is her definition of de-risking then, and how does it differ from the idea of decoupling? According to her office, de-risking of economic relations would include making the EU economy and industry more competitive and resilient, better using the existing EU toolbox of trade instruments, developing new defense tools for critical sectors, and seeking closer alignment with partners around the world. She also called for the creation of a mechanism for scrutinizing overseas investment by EU companies in a small number of sensitive technologies that could enhance the military capabilities of rivals. Finally, von der Leyen argued that Beijing's ultimate goal is the overturning of the current world order to be replaced with a Sino-centric one. Quote, China's reach stretches across all countries and global institutions, and its ambitions are far greater still. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, it is the largest lender to developing countries, and its economic, industrial, and military power puts into question any notion of China itself still being a developing country. We have seen a very deliberate hardening of China's overall strategic posture for some time, and it has now been matched by a ratcheting up of increasingly assertive actions. Most telling were President Xi's parting words to Putin on the steps outside the Kremlin when he said, "Right now there are changes the likes of which we have not seen for 100 years, and we are the ones driving these changes together. The Chinese Communist Party's clear goal is a systemic change of the international order, with China at its center." End quote. Regular viewers will recall rhetoric coming from Beijing in recent months, which could suggest a similar conclusion. Like I said, this language is quite hawkish by EU standards, but it is unclear whether some European state leaders share the same view. Ms. von der Leyen is joining French President Macron on a trip to the People's Republic of China next week. Spain's President Sanchez was already in China earlier this week for the Boao Forum, which we followed a few days ago. At the event, Sanchez expressed, quote, Europe and Asia must join forces to address global challenges and seize every opportunity to promote dialogue and cooperation. End quote. US-based Politico writes this week that Germany's Christian Democrats, the country's largest opposition group, quote, are planning to shift away from the pragmatic stance toward China that characterized Angela Merkel's 16 years as Chancellor, claiming that maintaining peace through trade has failed, end quote. According to the draft position paper, the outlet writes, the Conservatives say the idea of keeping peace through economic cooperation, quote, has failed with regard to Russia, but increasingly also China, end quote. How is Beijing reacting to this rising hawkishness from Europeans? Something that Beijing should have anticipated after, from Europe's point of view, backing Russia's war in Ukraine. China's envoy to the EU, Fu Cong, gave several interviews and speeches this week. A major theme, which we have seen from the Foreign Ministry generally, as well as state media, is that the EU should reject US pressure to decouple from China. Speaking to UK-based Financial Times, Fu expressed that Europe should reject Washington's demands to curb trade with China, claiming that the US would, quote, stop at nothing to disrupt normal relations between the bloc and China, end quote. Fu pointed to the Netherlands joining US efforts to restrict exports to China of its high-end semiconductor making technology this year as evidence that the Netherlands, quote, yielded to the pressure of the US, end quote. Beijing's EU envoy added, quote, who in their right mind would abandon such a thriving market as big as China? It will only be at their own peril. We do hope that the European governments and the European politicians can see where their interests lie and then resist the unwarranted pressure from the US. They need to be mindful of the fact that China cannot sit there and see its own interests being trampled like this without taking any action in response. End quote. It is unclear whether Beijing elites truly believe this framing, or whether it simply is a rhetorical tool to undermine solidarity by appealing to national pride in domestic European politics. For what it is worth, and this is simply anecdotal, my own conversations with Beijing officials and academics over the last few years suggest, for many in China at least, it is the former, that they actually believe that rising Sino-skepticism in Europe is primarily due to US political pressure rather than, in large part, due to indigenous concerns in Europe itself of Chinese domestic and international behavior. If this is indeed the case, it would suggest an ideological blind spot among the Beijing political elite and intelligentsia, which at best can lead to suboptimal policy choices and at worst serious diplomatic and foreign policy mistakes. In response to Ursula von der Leyen's Thursday speech, Fu Cong, in an interview with Chinese state-run CGTN, expressed, quote, that speech contained a lot of misrepresentation and misinterpretation of Chinese policies and the Chinese positions. Whoever wrote that speech for President von der Leyen does not really understand China or deliberately distorted Chinese positions. End quote. Wang Lutong, Director General for European Affairs at the Chinese Foreign Ministry, also in response to von der Leyen's speech, warned that the EU was playing a dangerous game, adding in a Twitter post, quote, the EU side talks a lot about de-risking recently. If there is any risk, it is the risk of linking trade with ideology and national security and creating bloc confrontation. End quote. The coverage in state media is interesting too. We can see a more nuanced critique of the Europeans, in stark contrast to the aggressive treatment against the US so prevalent in state media in recent years, suggesting that Beijing indeed still wishes to maintain a constructive relationship with the EU. Look at this framing, for example, from the state-run Global Times this week. Quote, judging from von der Leyen's speech, we can see the shadow of various debates on Europe's China policy over the past period, including naive views on China, reducing dependence on China, China's special responsibility in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and emphasizing the differences in ideology between China and Europe, which reflects the fact that Europe's China policy is still in the midst of a debate. It goes without saying that the EU's policy towards China currently faces contradictions and dilemmas, but there can be no doubt that various sectors hope to maintain the possibility of cooperation with China independently from the US. End quote. Meanwhile, Fu Cong also called for greater EU-China engagement, expressing in yet another interview this week, quote, we hope to conduct in-depth exchanges on economic, financial and fiscal policies to strengthen multi-bilateral policy coordination and deepen cooperation. End quote. Next up, cryptocurrency and China. Hey guys, I hope you're having a great weekend. If you're enjoying today's episode of China Update, a special Sunday report, don't forget to hit that like button. Sharing and liking are also huge helps, particularly sharing. This is a massive help for the channel. And as always, anyone who can go the extra mile and be part of the community that keeps the channel sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. As always, thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. In Thursday's video, we discussed the news that FTX head Sam Bankman-Fried has been charged with paying tens of millions of dollars in bribes to unnamed PRC officials. We have now learned through Financial Times reporting that Binance has lied about its connections to the PRC too. The UK-based Japanese-owned outlet reports that, quote, Binance hid substantial links to China for several years, contradicting executives' claims that the crypto exchange left the country after a clampdown on the industry in late 2017, according to internal company documents seen by the Financial Times. End quote. They add that Chief Executive Changpeng Zhao and others holding senior positions repeatedly instructed employees to hide the company's Chinese presence. This included, the outlet writes, an office in use until at least the end of 2019, and one Chinese bank that was used to pay some employees' salaries. In one alleged message from Zhao, the chief executive expressed, quote, we no longer publish our office addresses. People in China can directly say that our office is not in China. End quote. With both these revelations this week, the web of fraud and bad faith conduct within the crypto space is now increasingly touching on the Chinese side of the Pacific. We will continue to follow this space closely. And on this topic of crypto, one more brief development. On Friday at the Boao Forum, a senior official at the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, called for stronger regulation of digital finance, taking the opportunity to indirectly take a swipe at the US. Quote, risks and fraud associated with cryptocurrency, including the two American banks that ran into troubles after providing many services for cryptocurrency, from taking deposits to settlement, showed that regulators should respect rules when innovating regulation. The regulation philosophy and capability must be upgraded to ensure financial innovation won't come at the cost of financial stability. End quote. Chinese officials have long taken a hardline approach to the crypto industry since a national crackdown on the sector in 2017, though now some officials, for example Liao Min, a vice finance minister, are concerned that the People's Republic of China is missing the train on building international digital finance infrastructure and global governance norms. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a wonderful day wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.